Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. This video is a review of the lovely Eureka limited edition set of Universal horror and horror adjacent films entitled Maniacal Mayhem, which brings together the classic 1936 The Invisible Ray, the super underrated 1940 Black Friday, and the really wonderful sort of bookend to Universal horror, which is 1951's The Strange Door, which is the sister film with 1952's The Black Castle that's in the Universal Terror set. Now, this is just like their other package releases of Universal titles. These are all new or newer masters done by Universal that were handled here in the US by Shout Factory and the Universal Horror volumes, and also some of them have been handled by Kino Lorber as standalone releases. Now, the masters are the same as the US editions, but unfortunately they couldn't use the same extras. So the US versions have their own commentaries and extras, and the Eureka sets have their own commentaries and extras, and they're exclusive. But the source masters are the same. As I've mentioned before, I think the Eureka presentations are the better options for people just looking for the best overall version, because they have more care and effort put into the actual packaging and the booklet and the lovely artwork, but also trying to find unifying themes to make packages of these films, even though I myself would prefer them being done in chronological order as multi-volume sets, or the dream is like one big mammoth set of everything that's considered Universal horror, from Dracula in 1931 to The Black Castle in 1952, but unfortunately that's seemingly never going to happen. But if you're going to release them in batches, I do prefer having a unified theme. I would prefer The Black Castle and The Strange Door being together, because they were made back to back, but I will give Eureka credit for at least coming up with a theme per package. And they also do usually a better job at doing the disc encoding and presentation of the same masters. So that all those factors, combined with the fact that even as Region B imports, these are usually still significantly cheaper than the Shout Factory volumes, I think makes these the versions to go for. And I think they are more impressive than the Shout Factory presentations, though if you have the budget and you're a diehard fan, you will want both for all of the exclusive extras and commentaries. So with that out of the way, we'll jump into the first film, which is The Invisible Ray. And this film is very much more of a science fiction film, less so of a horror film, but it does have enough horror tinges and elements that do keep it as part of the Universal canon. It's also important for being the penultimate film of the original first wave of Universal horror films under the Laemmles, because after this point, with The Invisible Ray and Dracula's Daughter both coming out in 1936, the Laemmles had lost the studio, and horror films would essentially be killed off until new Universal, under different leadership, decided to revive them, first with a successful reissue of Dracula and Frankenstein in 1938, and then starting the real silver age of Universal horror with Son of Frankenstein in 1939. So that makes The Invisible Ray and Dracula's Daughter very important, and you can also tell it's still the original style of Universal horror. It has the much more unique qualifiers. It has the more European flavor. It's got all the hallmarks of being an original style Universal horror film, and it's obviously much more nuanced and detailed and made with quality and care than what you see in the Silver Age Universal films that were eventually, they very quickly reverted to cranking them out on a production line as B films and programmers. And so outside of the bigger films like Son of Frankenstein and The Wolfman, all the other Universal horror films are cranked out with short run times, and again on this assembly line, and none of them have the style and quality craftsmanship and frankly the artiness and the soul of the original Universal horror film. So that's always a distinction you have, and The Invisible Ray, along with Dracula's Daughter, is the unfortunate end of that. It is a film that does have a mixed reputation, but we do also have another legendary pairing of Boris Karloff with Bela Lugosi, and this is really the last time they were on equal footing in a film, although Karloff still has his surname and top billing as, Karloff, the uncanny, or just simply Karloff, and of course got paid substantially more and is the nominal star, and Lugosi always got shortchanged by practically every studio in Hollywood. But he does hold his own here very well, and it's really nice to see him playing a distinguished scientist who also isn't a villain and is very dapper looking and well put together and intelligent and a decent human being, so he's not playing a villain here, and he doesn't go mad. So it's like his Beatus Vertigast and the Black Cat without any of the craziness or the bad aspects that character gets into in his madness. So it's nice seeing Lugosi playing a straight role, essentially. But The Invisible Ray, again, is very much science fiction, and interestingly does seem to predate some discoveries that would be made later, although it is very much still ripped out of 1930s science fiction pulp magazine stories, and some aspects of it almost feel like it's out of a serial because, of course, the Invisible Ray itself manifests in several different ways, one of which is essentially a death ray. So you've got a death ray in this film, because what great science fiction story with villainy and madness doesn't have a death ray? It goes with the territory. So it's an interesting blend. It doesn't always necessarily work, and I must admit it's a film that did take me a little bit to warm up to, because it also has a slightly longer runtime for a Universal horror film, even of this era, and it's also got a different pace to it. It was directed by Lambert Hillier, who also directed Dracula's Daughter, and it's surprising he took over both films from other people, and also surprising he was even given these assignments, because he did a lot of westerns, and he's probably most famous for being a serial director. He would direct the first Columbia Batman serial in 1943, for example. So his direction tends to favor simplicity in terms of the setups, and also getting a good speed and rhythm to the story. So it also kind of makes both of these films feel unified in that sense, and that they both have a lot of interesting story elements and some great performances, but they always leave you feeling just a little bit unfulfilled. And here in this film, there does seem to have been a lot of discussion about the script, which is why the original director, Stuart Walker, left, and they wound up having to rewrite the script anyway and go over schedule and over budget. So it's kind of ironic that they switched directors when all Stuart Walker wanted was more time on the script and stuff. And some of that, I think, kind of reflects in the film, which also not only shares a lot of plot similarities, but also some of the plot structure, some of the characterizations, and also even some of the sets from Werewolf of London from the previous year, which was directed by Stuart Walker. So I think The Invisible Ray actually has a lot of the DNA of Werewolf of London, even down to having Karloff playing an aged scientist character who is not very sociable, rather disagreeable, who has a significantly younger wife who is not in a great predicament herself, but she feels devoted to her scientist husband, who she doesn't really love. And of course, the scientist husband is not only disagreeable, but also gets a particular affliction, and eventually goes on a sort of mission of revenge against those around him, although here in Invisible Ray, it's madness caused by radium X poisoning, but in Werewolf of London, it's just, lycanthropy. So it's a little bit different, but you can very much recognize the plot similarities between the two, and I think that also is down to Stuart Walker being the original director of this and then getting removed. So you can notice the similarities. But it is a film you can warm up to, I think. Some people really love it. Some people kind of write it off because it's not as much of a horror film. But it's got a lot going for it. It's also got an above-average cast. You've even got Beulah Bondi in a nice role. But particular for me, I think the real standout is Frances Drake as the wife character. She's wonderful in every film she's ever in, but she manages to give this underwritten character at least some semblance of humanity. And you're really able to feel the internal turmoil of this character much more than you do in other Universal films, and I think much more than you do with pretty much the same character in Werewolf of London. Although Valerie Hobson does what she can in that film with that character, it's still very underwritten. But I do think Drake was a wonderful addition to any film she was ever in, and this is her other major horror credit, coming a year after her great performance in the masterpiece Mad Love for MGM. So basically she's got two two giant films in classic horror to her credit, but I just really loved her performance here. So I think aside from Karloff and Lugosi, she's the real acting standout. Karloff's character is rather interesting because you never can quite get a read on him. Some of that is due, I think, to the inconsistencies of the script, but he's a man driven by science and also a man with at least some kindness in his heart, but it's quite hard to get a read on him because he does quickly descend into first being blinded by his scientific pursuits, but also then by madness once he gets affected by the Radium X he discovers. And I think that's also borrowing a page from The Invisible Man, because the poisoning and the antidote that's developed does push him further into madness, like the invisibility drugs from The Invisible Man. So there is, I think, some sort of borrowing elements from previous Universal films that you'll recognize here in this film in particular. Interestingly, again, Lugosi as Dr. Benet is a respectable scientist who's not a villainous character, and it's Lugosi finally getting to play a leading, heroic, dashing figure who doesn't go crazy or try to kill anybody or anything. And interestingly, he holds his own with Karloff in terms of, as usual, managing to keep an even level, even though he's playing the less developed character who could be very stock and is obviously lower on the billing and got paid a fraction of what Karloff did. But it's just really lovely to see him in this film actually playing a nice guy who's also trying to save this person. He develops this antidote and knows the terrible toll it will take on Karloff's character of Janos Rook. And we see Janos, completely devolve into madness, and we get the wonderful invisible ray glowing effect by the incredible John P. Fulton, and we get the wonderful visual of Karloff staggering around in the dark with this glowing, ominous effect on him that's just fantastic. And of course, he has a death touch too, and so anyone he touches dies. But the poisoning of the Radium X and the usage of the antidote does quickly drive Rook completely insane. And while Dr. Benet tries to use the Radium X for the good of mankind, Rook, in his madness, not only fakes his own death, but enacts a scheme of revenge to essentially kill off all of the other characters of the film that he has, in his madness, decided wronged him. So this is also an early sort of progenitor of the wronged central character trying to do away with all of his past acquaintances. So like in other films in Karloff's Mad Doctor cycle for Columbia and later on in the late 30s and early 40s, you can sort of see this as a proto Dr. Phibes type scenario. It very much is. That's what it becomes. But again, I think you can also recognize the shared DNA with Werewolf of London. So it's an interesting film. It's got a lot of things going on. It's got really several different plots, and it's also shoved into, I think it's about a 79-minute runtime. So it's a little longer than your typical Universal film at this time. But also, it's got so many things going on. It also skips over certain elements, and including some of the deaths. We don't even see a lot of the deaths on screen. They're just alluded to, which is interesting. So I think that's part of the inconsistency of the plotting and why it took me a little while to warm up to this, actually. It wasn't one of my more favorite Universal horrors that are more sci-fi oriented at first, but it definitely grew on me. And you have to remember, this is at the end of the original Universal horror period. This and Dracula's Daughter are the very end of the golden age of Universal horror, which was also the golden age of horror in classic Hollywood and the sound era. So it makes it unique in those ways. And I think there's enough to recommend here that really make it fascinating. Right from the opening science set piece of Rook showing this wonderful display with some really intricate special effects, actually, for the time, of a meteorite coming to Earth and leaving imprints of itself across time. And that's also how he traces it to Africa and why they go on the dig to eventually discover Radium X. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. There's a lot of different elements that are fascinating. I don't think it necessarily fully gels as a film, and I think part of that's due to the production and the rewriting and the change in directors and things. But what remains is a really fascinating Karloff and Lugosi vehicle that is much more obvious science fiction than horror, but with some echoes of past Universal horror films, and it's quite unique in the Universal horror canon. I think it's a fascinating film to come back to, and the more you see it, the more you study it, the more you're able to just sift through it, and it wins you over more. And it's I think again it remains quite unique in the Universal horror canon. Now for the picture quality, this is another new Universal 2K master. It's credited, as are the other two films in the set, as a 2K master from Original Elements. It is far beyond what was on the old DVD that we've had for years, and of course far beyond even the old Laserdisc I have. But you still get the feeling that it's coming directly from Print Elements, because unfortunately there is quite a lot of wear baked into this element. However, it doesn't detract, it's just a continual presence. So you do need to expect to see frame wobble, consistent scratches and specks and lines and things pop up. Yeah, they seem to be in bursts more. They are consistent throughout this transfer, but there are moments of heavier wear that pop up. However, again, it's not really detracting from the experience. You very much get the feeling that you're watching a scan of a fine-grained print or something as is, and it's been well preserved, but it just has the wear of time inherent. So while it would be nice to see this fully restored, I do really like the naturalness of this presentation, but do go in expecting to see quite significant wear throughout. And again, it seems to get heavier in certain spots, but again, nothing that's ultimately detracting, and it does have a nice natural feel to it. And again, it is far beyond what's on the old DVD, and I think that helps to really get into the experience of this film, especially if you've never seen it before, because there's a lot of interesting details, and especially things like the opening sort of dazzling special effects sequence with the story of the meteorite journey and other things. So I think this is a substantial upgrade over the old DVD, but do keep in mind there's quite a bit of wear in this element. I should also mention that there's also a couple little spots of where it drops to a slightly lower quality, which is a little noticeable, and there's also one or two spots of some very minor missing frames. So all this stuff does seem to be inherent to the element they were working from, and hopefully one day we can see brand new 4K scans and fully restored masters of all the Universal horror canon, but of course that's probably rather unlikely due to cost and popularity of these films being much less than the core monster branded films. But still, this is a significant improvement, and I think anybody will recognize that who's seen the film before. The audio is the original mono mix in lossless quality, and I think this is where you have more issues than the picture, because there's significant wear throughout this track. It does sound good, but it is very limited, seemingly due to the source they had to work with. There's a number of ticks and thumps and pops throughout. There are one or two slight almost jumps in the track that are minor, but there. And then there's also not only hiss inherent still, which obviously you need that natural hiss, but some moments do seem to have a slight bursts of additional hiss. But there's also some sections where the audio does have a sort of, for lack of a better term, an almost metallic feel to some of the dialogue, and there is some bits of hum inherent in this track. So I think this is just inherent to the source, but it did seem a bit more pronounced than how I've seen this film before on DVD and Laserdisc. But on those, the audio was also severely compromised due to the source they were working with. So I think all this stuff is just source inherent, and unfortunately, this is probably the best element that they have currently. But do be aware that the audio here does have some significant issues baked into it, and it's still presentable and still nice to listen to, but you are going to run into quite a bit of defects and damage throughout. For the extras, we have another new commentary by Stephen Jones and Kim Newman. Again, they do their wonderful double act and energetic conversation about the production of this film, biographical information about the cast and crew, the script and production and how it went, and the sort of kerfluffle when Stuart Walker was taken off the picture, and also the the science in the film being a bit ahead of its time and surprisingly rather realistic for a film of this type. This being a Karloff and Lugosi vehicle and being the last time they were on relatively even footing on screen. And also, they talk about their love for this film and all the interesting elements and things. So it's another of their must-listen great tracks and a great addition to this set. So I'm really happy that Eureka commissions new commentaries for all the films in these sets. We also get two nice stills galleries like the other Eureka releases with original poster artwork, production images, lobby cards, and then even some home video art VHS releases. We do get the original trailer for the film, but unfortunately, like some of the trailers that are given to Eureka for these sets, it's an old standard def upscale. It doesn't look very good, but it was also not encoded very well, and it seems to be running at the wrong frame rate, so it just looks really choppy and almost slow motion and noisy and full of artifacts and things. So again, I think this is just Eureka being provided a not very well encoded or a poorly encoded version of an old standard def trailer. It's also got very noisy audio that's got some whine in it and stuff, so obviously this trailer was not in very good shape. It's also a real art reissue trailer, so obviously the original release trailer does not survive, but at least we have a trailer here for the film that survives, and it's on the disc, but unfortunately, somehow the presentation of this trailer got goofed up, which I have seen once or twice on some of these Eureka sets. So I just think that probably they were given just a poorly done version of this trailer. But again, that's really the only thing I can say against this particular set is this trailer is done from a poor quality source. Again, probably coming from Universal. Then we move on to 1940's Black Friday, which is a Universal programmer, another film billed as a Karloff and Lugosi vehicle, but really, unfortunately, Lugosi got shuttled off to a very minor part after the original casting was changed, because apparently Boris Karloff did not want to play the lead role and instead wanted to play the professor role, which is more secondary. And so really the star of this film is Stanley Ridges, who is more of a character actor, but he plays the fascinating dual role of Professor George Kingsley, who's a kindly professor at a small college, and the gangster Red Canon. And the reason why this is a dual role is Karloff plays Dr. Sovak, who in a film that has bookends of him being led to the death chamber, gives his confession to a reporter who then reads Sovak's tale of performing an early unsupervised brain transplant when his friend Professor Kingsley is run over by Red Canon on the run from police, who is also similarly smashed up in the hospital. And so he transplants a section of Canon's brain into Professor Kingsley to keep him alive. But then elements of the gangster Red Canon start to manifest themselves in the recuperating Professor Kingsley, and then Dr. Sovak learns of the massive fortune of stolen money that Red Canon had hid away somewhere, and then decides he will try to draw out the gangster persona in his friend to recover this money to then fund his long-held dreams of being a great medical practitioner and well-known in the world. Karloff's Dr. Sovak then takes his best friend to New York City and tries to actually have him start reliving Red Canon's life in a just completely perverse and dark and unsettling, essentially destruction of his own supposed friend. So it's a fascinating story conceit, which then gives us this incredible dual performance from Stanley Ridges, who goes through changes and portrays the two different characters entirely through the physicality of his performance. There's not really any makeup. It's all in the physical way he carries himself. He even speaks differently, and of course the professor has the sort of cliche doddering mannerisms and has his glasses that he wears. But it's a remarkable performance, and Ridges is really the star of the film, even though he's not given star billing. But originally it was to have been Karloff playing this dual role and Bela Lugosi playing the manipulative doctor. But again, due to the casting switch, Lugosi is essentially shuttled to playing the head lead gangster, who was the chief rival of Red Cannon and who instigated his demise. And of course, when the reborn canon starts going around in New York, it freaks everyone out that you have a completely different person with the mannerisms and knowledge of a dead man. So you see the film playing around with these ideas. And if any of this is sounding familiar to other stories, it should, because this film was written by Curt Siodmak, the king of brain swapping, who would take these elements and refine them in Donovan's Brain, which was his most famous novel and turned into the 1953 science fiction classic. So this is very much a proto Donovan's Brain. It has a lot of the same elements and another really fascinating lead performance where you have an actor essentially playing two different people inhabiting the same form and doing the differences entirely in a physical performance without makeup or doing anything over the top. So, unfortunately, because the film is still a Universal programmer, it's only 70 minutes long, it has a lot of fascinating elements, but it doesn't fully realize things. And Karloff, along with Lugosi, frequently disappear from the film because we're focusing on the professor character now in the Red Cannon gangster guise. And because the film then has to eventually jump back to Lugosi's gangster character or Karloff's doctor character, it does take you out of the story of the dual act going on in the Stanley Ridges performance. So we go constantly back and forth between a psychological melodrama, a gangster film, and a science fiction Mad Doctor film. And it's kind of an unbalanced mixture of all three of these. And so that's why I think it's obviously not as satisfying as what you eventually see in Donovan's Brain, which focuses entirely on the dual act and brain concept. Of course, in a different way, but it's very much a return to this idea. And Siodmak would always be doing his brain swapping in the Universal 40s horror sequels. And the Frankenstein series pretty much turned into nothing but trying to put someone else's brain inside Frankenstein's creature in each subsequent film. And of course, it makes sense that all this stuff came from the same person because Curt Siodmak apparently had a fascination with brain transplants. But you get that here in Black Friday in a fascinating way. And it's Stanley Ridges' performance that's the big takeaway. Unfortunately, Lugosi being made into just a side gangster character feels like a very odd fit, and it's sad to see him get demoted to such a degree. However, he gives it his usual 200,000%, and even if you're not a Lugosi fan, I think you have to give him credit because he manages to make it work, even though it's Bela Lugosi doing stereotypical gangster dialogue. He's quite good in this film. Unfortunately, he's given a terrible demise that's very demeaning, and it's a demeaning part for him to begin with. You can see Karloff in the dual role very well. You can see Lugosi as the doctor very well. And because Lugosi manages to make the gangster part work, I think you could even see Lugosi playing the dual role of the kindly professor and the gangster character. So I think you could shift around Karloff and Lugosi in any of the roles, actually. And while I wish Lugosi was in one of the central roles, and I wish the doctor character was more present in the film, it's Stanley Ridges giving this incredible performance that makes the film most memorable. So it's essentially a Universal horror film that's more of a Mad Doctor science fiction film that actually is more of a Warner Brothers gangster film. And it does all this in about 70 minutes. So it still moves with a good energy. It's over rather quickly. And it's a fun film to return to. But it's just a shame that Lugosi was just demoted to a demeaning role, even though he still gives it everything. And Karloff is just kind of there because his doctor character just disappears for most of the film. But again, it's the sort of messed up aspect of someone who is supposedly this man's friend, actively encouraging his destruction and mental deterioration simply for money. and the incredible dual performance from Stanley Ridges, who is just phenomenal here. So this is a film you should just see alone for the great central performance. And it's always the fun conceit that you see in a lot of Golden Age pulp fiction and comics of the kindly old professor or somebody getting knocked on the head and then thinking they're a super criminal or something. That was done many times in Golden Age comics, Golden Age Batman comics especially, and would later turn up in the King Tut character on the 1966 Batman series. So it's an old cliched idea, but here you get it with brain transplants, and it's Curt Siodmak playing with these concepts before he would turn it into Donovan's Brain years later. In terms of picture quality, this is again credited as a new 2K master, and it looks substantially better compared to the old DVD. But again, there is quite a bit of inherent wear. There are some occasional scratches and lines, specks and things, a little bit of frame movement, and of course you do need to expect quality loss for any of the dupes and transitions and opticals and things. But it is a healthy improvement over the DVD, and it makes the film much more enjoyable to have the such a uptick in visual quality. There are some moments where the damage does get a little bit more prevalent. There's a couple brief little spots where some scratches and lines do stay a little bit constant, and those are probably the biggest drawbacks visually, that you do have some moments where the damage isn't just fleeting, where it actually stays for quite a bit. I think biggest of all is around the 11.5 minute mark. We have, for at least several minutes, what seems to be at least to the end of that reel, where that damage does stay constant, where you have scratches and marks that remain. It just seems like this was the best element Universal had to work with, but again, it makes you wish that these films would also get the royal 4K treatment, because Universal Horror is the most famous and identified with Universal as a studio, and one would hope that the lesser discussed films in the Universal Horror canon would also get the royal treatment that the big crown jewel or big known titles would. But again, these are lesser known, lesser seen, lesser discussed, so at least they have gotten a refresh in 2K and these nicer preservation masters, but all the wear of the elements is baked in. There are also some little bits of what seem to be dupe footage or stock footage as well, which obviously have a little quality drop off, but again, this is a huge improvement over the DVD. In terms of the audio quality, we again have a lossless presentation of the original mono mix, but again, there is quite a lot of source limitations and defects that do appear here. There are some bursts of hiss, there is some noise, there is some crackle, unfortunately, in some places that all seem to be inherent to the source. There's some hum, some ticks and thumps throughout. It's an overall decent sounding track. It sounds pretty much like how the DVD sounds from what I remember of that, but do expect some defects that pop up, and there is quite a bit of crackle and damage in that section where those scratches and visual damage lasts for a couple minutes. So I think that whole section of to the end of that reel was probably damaged or compromised in picture and sound. So overall, both the picture and sounds do suffer from the overall element condition. This is a big step up, an improvement over the DVD, but you do need to expect that you're going to see all kinds of wear due to just time and condition that have developed over the years, and then the film was reissued a number of times as well, which only furthered damage and wear. So all that stuff is still inherent. So you're going to see some fluctuations and some scenes being a little bit darker and things like that, and some obvious wear in the audio track. But on the whole, it is a nice 2K preservation master and a huge improvement over the DVD. In terms of the extras, we have a brand new commentary track by Kevin Lyons and Jonathan Rigby again. They have another wonderful track here that goes to the production of the film, the sort of casting kerfluffle when Karloff changed roles and Lugosi getting demoted. Nice focus on Stanley Ridges as the real fascinating and great performance, and the real star of this film, who's not on who's not one of the marquee names, and that this is a real career highlight for him. They talk about the director Arthur Lubin and how this film was put together and how it's a fascinating precursor to Donovan's Brain and has a lot of Curt Siodmak's brain fascination throughout, and also that it's kind of like a mixture of three different film genres, and while it's not fully successful, it's also ridiculously entertaining and has this incredible lead performance that is so good that you keep coming back to this film and you just wish it had a little bit more in terms of runtime and plot development, because the conceit is so fascinating and the performance is so good. And I think that's why Curt Siodmak would return to this in Donovan's Brain, because I think you get the feeling here that he's got a great concept, but it's not fully fledged yet. Like he knew he could probably realize it better, and so he turned it into a book. We get more wonderful stills galleries with original posters, lobby cards, production images, and home video VHS artwork, which I really love. We do get the original trailer for the film. It's once again standard def and upscaled, and unfortunately of very low quality. This is also the very striking and sad trailer where, as part of the marketing campaign, they decided they apparently hadn't demeaned Bela Lugosi enough, because the trailer shows Lugosi getting hypnotized on set to give a better performance in his death scene. And while it's a very striking and odd promotional tie-in concept, it's also sad to see essentially the promotion of the film insinuating that Lugosi had to be hypnotized to be a better actor, which is a shame, because he's really good in this film with this nothing part he's demoted to. But it's also a fascinating artifact of film promotion, and at least that's here on the disc. But also it's just not of very good quality. So it's like most of these trailers, they're still stuck as old, crummy standard def scans from years and years ago. But at least we have some form of it here. Then we come to the third and final film in this set, which is 1951's The Strange Door, based on a Robert Louis Stevenson story and starring Charles Laughton and Boris Karloff. Now, as I said in my other video and at the start of this is very much the film that goes back to back with its follow-up, The Black Castle. And this film, The Strange Door in 1951 and The Black Castle in 1952, were not only a new sort of venture for Universal into these period thrillers that were also horror and also gothic, but it's also the end of the classic Universal horror period, which the commentary gets into, and I think they're right. If you had to pick an ending point, I think you have to start with Dracula in 1931 as the real start of Universal horror, and then it pretty much ends here in 1951 and 1952 with these two period gothic horror-tinged adventure swashbuckler type films. But this one is less of a swashbuckler than The Black Castle that followed it. But they are very much a 1-2 punch. They have a lot of the same crew and the same mentality, and obviously the success of this film went right into The Black Castle. But here the story is based on Stevenson and is more of a, I guess technically it's more of a gothic chiller with some swashbuckling adventure elements. There are, some fisticuffs and a little bit of swordplay, but nothing like what you see in The Black Castle. This is more of a slow burner, and this is directly based on Stevenson. So not only is it public domain, but I think they were very much, it's never expressly said, but I think they were just inspired by Val Lewton making The Body Snatcher with Karloff in 1945, also based on Stevenson and also being a beautiful period, atmospheric, unbelievably masterful horror film. And I think that's probably what they were shooting for here. It very much seems to follow in that vein because they're also doing Stevenson and you've got Boris Karloff in a lead role. But this is Charles Laughton's film. This is, make no mistake, Laughton is incredible in this film. He's charming, he's villainous as hell, he's nasty, He's not chewing the scenery, though. He is entirely in character from the opening of the film onward, and this is directly coming from Stevenson's story about a person with far too much in terms of riches and power, just desiring to not only control people, but to get revenge for things we don't necessarily know about at first. And he gets his revenge simply by destroying people and getting such malicious pleasure out of tearing them apart, essentially, like the crazy kids who like pulling the wings off flies. It's that type of scenario. But here, Laughton just goes for broke, and some people might label him as going over the top and things, but he's a delight here. He's a life force, and you quickly realize this character is completely insane, and you love him for it because he's so maliciously evil and but so also charming about it in the best sort of Charles Laughton way. So he walks off with the film because you've got Charles Laughton in the lead role in this kind of role. So, of course, no one could possibly keep hold of the picture once Laughton appears. Karloff does very well in the sort of I mean, he's basically the longtime servant who also lurks about the castle and tries to help the original owner of said castle, who is the Laughton character's brother that he's kept locked away in a hidden jail cell in the torture dungeon of the castle for all of these years in a vain attempt to not only control his brother, but also drive him completely insane. Laughton's character has also kept the daughter of his brother under his protection and is now trying to have her married off to this ne'er-do-well that he has essentially chosen in a bar and framed for murder, and now keeps as another prisoner in his castle and enjoys manipulating and psychologically torturing along with everyone else in his orbit. There are, of course, many other great faces and wonderfully nasty characters in this castle. Probably the chief and best among them is Laughton's chief henchman, who is played by the wonderful Michael Pate, who has a great, wonderful presence in this film, just like he does in The Black Castle. So he's a great addition to both of these films, and one of the faces that helps to unify them along with Karloff. Laughton's villainous sire also has these wonderful cronies that always follow him around and hang on his every word. So that's a fascinating little sociological study right there with him and his essential cronies that are following him around and picking up every breadcrumb and being just fascinating in and of themselves. So there's not a wasted frame here in this film, but Laughton so completely dominates the film that everybody else kind of gets shortchanged a bit, simply because he's such a vivid presence. The film was directed by Joseph Pevney, who had started out as an actor and really acquits himself well here. This is a well-directed film with great production detail, even though they're on a limited budget. And the fact that it's shot in black and white, I think, really adds to the atmospherics, although you will see them borrowing a little bit from other Universal horror films, and especially in terms of some of the music cues, as Universal would do. So you'll see things pop up here. And also structurally, I think you'll notice at least some similarities to The Raven, because you've got a central character dominating and controlling everybody that he keeps locked inside of this estate. And Karloff plays the subservient character who gets, bashed around and controlled by the lead crazy person who's got everybody locked up in this castle. And Karloff's character is kind of scheming to get out of his clutches. So, I think you can see parallels to The Raven, and there is even a climax that involves a room with the walls closing in on our hero and heroine. So, somebody had to be thinking of The Raven. It seems pretty obvious. At least they were thinking of Universal's Raven, not the Poe poem, of course, because the film has nothing to do with Poe at all. So I think The Raven had to have been an influence on the story, but it's still being based on Stevenson's story. And I think if you look at it as being influenced by The Raven and The Body Snatcher, I think that makes sense. But this is a wonderful film. It's fascinating. It's involving. It's interesting. It has malicious humor. It has the gothic trappings of period detail and unease. It's based on Stevenson and it's doing Stevenson's story. Actually, I think it does it justice, actually. And it's just beautiful to see Charles Laughton go to work. I mean, he is the life force of this film, and he's not going over the top. Everything he does is called for, and it's such a vivid characterization that it just dominates everything else in the film. But the whole film is very well made. It is, along with The Black Castle, one of the hidden gems of Universal horror, and at least Universal horror going out on a high note with these two films that are very much a pair is nice to see that the final real horror films before going into science fiction were far above average and far better than most of the films that preceded them. So if you were, ranking the Universal horror films as a whole, these last two films of The Strange Door and The Black Castle are very much above most of the films that came before them, and really wonderful surprises because they're both incredibly well made and staged, and this is an absolute delight. And I'll go even further than that. I think you can see this starting to influence what we'd come to see in the Roger Corman Poe cycle in the 1960s. So while that had its own unique flavor, I think you can see those elements starting to come to the fore here in The Strange Door in particular, because we've got the central location, we've got the mad controlling figure, we've got Boris Karloff, and we've got the horror and gothic elements. So I think you could draw a connecting line between The Strange Door here with Lawton's performance, and eventually what we'd start to see in the Roger Corman and AIP films when we started the Poe cycle with House of Usher and Vincent Price. So I think you can feel some parallel connections there. Now here again, for the picture quality, we're talking about a brand new 2K master from Original Elements. So this is a major uptick in visual quality. It blows the DVD out of the water and is seemingly the same master that Kino Lorber used for their Blu-ray here in the US. I think of the three films in this set, this does show the least amount of wear and damage. It does still have a little bit inherent, which we have to expect, but it limits itself to just a tiny amount of frame movement here and there, an occasional light scratcher mark, and then one or two very, very tiny hairs that poke in and one or two very brief fleeting moments. But outside of that, this is the cleanest elements in this set that was used, and looks really fantastic for the production constraints that this film had, and being a sort of elevated B film, but not quite an A film. And it looks quite good, and again, it's far beyond what was on the old DVD presentation. So like The Black Castle, which is its sister film, this is very much a visual improvement. The audio is the original mono mix presented here in lossless quality, and does also sound quite healthy. It does have some age-related wear, so there are one or two ticks and pops that are rather minor, but thankfully it sounds pretty good on the whole and doesn't suffer some of the same inherent defects as the audio track on The Black Castle. So I think it sounds pretty good and similar to what was on the DVD. In terms of the supplements, we have another brand new Kim Newman and Stephen Jones commentary. They do their usual excellent job here. It's a very engaging track to listen to, and they go all into the biographical details of the stars and the production details and the director Joseph Pevney, and how this marks, along with The Black Castle, the sort of end of the original Universal horror canon, and how it and The Black Castle are not just sister films, but ridiculously above average, and are such incredible hidden gems in the Universal horror canon that really are far better than all the films that led up to them in the final sort of years of Universal horror. So they are both among the best of the Universal horror canon as a whole, and should be really looked at more closely because they are really hidden gems. So this is another great commentary from one of the great pairings and double acts of horror historian commentaries. We also have another great stills gallery of production stills, lobby cards, poster artwork, and also the VHS artwork nicely. Unfortunately, there is no trailer for this film on this disc, so I guess one doesn't survive. Interestingly, we also have 3 different radio adaptations of the original Stevenson story for your enjoyment, so you can see how the radio adaptations tried their hand at doing the same story, and in lossless quality as well, which is nice. It's nice when Eureka does these. They do try to source better sounding elements, and these are fascinating inclusions that I think everybody should give a listen to, and you can see the distinct differences because they were done for different shows and sometimes in different eras. So I love getting to look at different radio adaptations of the same story. Eureka also did this with The Most Dangerous Game and some of their other classic horror releases, so that's a really nice and fascinating inclusion here. Now to look at the packaging of this limited edition, we have this beautiful unique slipcover with original artwork from The Invisible Ray and featuring the Maniacal Mayhem title and the titles of the 3 films. This is done in the same style as their other releases, so it matches nicely on the shelf, and then we have the list of supplements on the back. Once the limited editions sell out, you will lose the slipcase, but the contents remain the same. They'll just use the slipcase art for the actual disc case. Here on the case, we have the poster artwork for each of the films, and then the credits on the back. The art is reversible, so you also get the art for Black Friday and the artwork for The Strange Door. The disc labels themselves follow the same design with a nice sort of tinted still from the films themselves. They get a lovely new booklet with a lovely original artwork, primarily focusing on Karloff for the covers, and this features nice write-ups and new essays for each of the 3 films. And then the usual Eureka technical credits as well. So those are my overall thoughts on the Eureka Region B release of Universal Horror titles in the Maniacal Mayhem collection. I think all 3 of these films are fascinating and absolute must-owns for all classic horror and Universal Horror fans, and of course all Karloff and Lugosi fans. But in particular, I think Eureka's overall packaging of these films is superior to their versions in the US, although you do lose out on the exclusive US extras and commentaries, so if you're a diehard fan, you'll want to have both releases. But if you're just trying to pick the one that is a better release overall and better encoded, the Eureka is definitely the way to go, and also is actually rather inexpensive, and you can get this for less than half the cost of one of the Shout Factory Universal Collection volumes on Blu-ray. So I would recommend you check out the Eureka release. This is the limited edition, which is still in print, but when they do revert to having to do the standard edition, it will still have the same great disc contents and presentations. You'll just lose out on the wonderful, fancy limited edition slipcover. Again, I think all these Eureka sets are really fascinating and must-owns, and the best overall presentations of these newer Universal Masters for the lesser-known and lesser-discussed films inside the Universal Horror canon, which are very important and should be better known and studied along the more famous films and the big names of the Universal Horror films. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic Universal Horror and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do check out the Eureka Universal Horror releases and their other classic horror releases, because they really do put in a lot of extra effort that I think make these a better option overall compared to the US Blu-ray releases of these same masters. And as always, please do keep supporting both boutique and studio label efforts by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.